Thank you all for being here. And Ms. Kuiper is a registered geologist and senior project manager with 25 years of experience as an environmental consultant, providing services to a variety of clients throughout the United States. She provides senior leadership on environmental due diligence portfolios, brownfield investigations, and cleanup energy facility siting, permitting, and natural resources. She enjoys educating her clients on a variety of environmental due diligence topics and considers herself an active team member in all of her clients' projects. She enjoys problem solving for her tribal, municipal, and state clients, where she uses her strong advocacy and diplomacy skills in a collaborative approach with stakeholders. And welcome.
Thank you. All right, thank you. Thanks, everybody. So we have a small group, so this is actually a great thing for me because I like to be conversational in my style. So if you have questions throughout my presentation, please feel free to raise your hand. And Ryan, can we get those doors closed? I mean, people can still come in, but it's a little bit of a distraction. So yeah, as Ryan said, this is not the cultural, what do we have here that was supposed to be speaking here? Oh, protecting our homelands, no. This is environmental due diligence, and essentially environmental due diligence as it's related to feed of trust transactions. My background, I've worked for one particular tribe in Oregon, the Grand Ronde tribe, and I've worked with them for about 15 to 18 years, and we've come a long way together in evaluating properties prior to moving that environmental piece of the feed of trust application over the years. And I've learned some things, and I wanted to share those with you guys. First of all, how many folks here are familiar with environmental due diligence, Phase 1 ESAs? There was a couple. Okay, a few. All right. For those of you who are not familiar, this presentation is for you. Basically what I'm going to do, I think about my presentation sort of like a dinner. You have something that's really great at the beginning, and then it gets kind of a little palate cleanser in the middle, and then something really juicy in the middle, and then something interesting at the end, and then maybe a little dessert. So you think of my presentation going like this. I'm going to talk a little bit about the process, why it's important to maybe review a property's environmental conditions even before you go into feed of trust, doing it internally among tribal staff, and then talk about that process, talk a little bit more about the environmental due diligence basics. Basically, that's the Phase 1 ESA process. Then we're going to have some fun, and we're going to have a visual quiz so you guys can look at some photographs and tell me what you see. Then I'm going to walk you through some tools that your tribal land staff, that you as tribal land staff can use at your disposal to evaluate properties even before you get an environmental professional, someone like me, to come out and do the work on behalf of you in the BIA as part of that feed of trust. And then finally, I wanted to talk a little bit about how you guys are using ArcGIS and maybe cataloging your environmental conditions site-wide or community-wide to look for brownfields opportunities, because they do exist and they are out there. And there's a lot of brownfield grants available to tribes for that. So, talking about the environmental due diligence in the BIA feed of trust process, the BIA has a handbook, and in that handbook there are multiple steps. The part that is really applicable to what I'm going to talk about today is really Step 7. And in Step 7, you will find that it references the Department of the Interior's Department Manual 602 for land acquisition, exchange, and disposal, Chapter 2 for real property pre-acquisition environmental site assessments. If you go to that manual, it's only 2 to 3 pages, I believe. You'll see it, and down at the bottom, they reference a standard called the ASTM. It's the American Society for Testing Materials. That's what BIA uses. That's what the Department of Interior is requiring all of its bureaus to use, and that's what's used in the industry, too. So when you're talking about environmental due diligence as part of feed of trust applications, you're really talking about the Phase 1 ESAs. Normally, well, not normally, they're required to be performed by an environmental professional. What people like myself do, we'll go out and do the site reconnaissance, the site visit, we'll conduct interviews, do the historical research, conduct an environmental records review on the property that the tribe is interested in bringing into trust. Or even if they're buying it in fee simple, it's always a good idea to conduct an environmental review on the property before you acquire it. The tribe would be required to provide information to the environmental professional, which is the purchase price if you're buying it in fee, any activity or use limitations, environmental liens, property title information, other publicly available information. And then there's the question of out-of-scope services. This ASTM standard that I'm going to talk about a little bit later is basically a list of what you see up here. What it doesn't include are other things that the tribe or BIA would be interested in, and that is your regulated building materials on your homes, asbestos, such as asbestos, lead-based paint, mold, even wetlands and indoor air quality issues. They are referenced in this standard, but they're not part of the standard. Those are extras. But standards that are applicable for tribal lands, standards that the BIA would use when they're looking at your fee to trust application to evaluate what you've done on your property through the phase one, would be your E1527 or E2247. And that second one is a little lesser known. That's actually for environmental site assessments that are done on forest land or your rural properties, so really large properties that you cover large swaths of land. Typically, we would use that standard, and that's perfectly acceptable to use that. With both standards, you have a shelf life, and this is important when you're working through a fee to trust application. When you go and you do your environmental site assessment, your environmental professional prepares a phase one ESA. It's good for a full year, provided that after 6 months you redo interviews and records reviews and a site reconnaissance. So if you've got an application with the BIA that's sitting and being reviewed, there's always this issue of what is the shelf life of that phase one ESA, and will the BIA make you go back and do some updating of that phase one before they get completed with the application. So that's pretty important. If you go and you look at the department manual that the Department of the Interior and BIA have, I've included it in you should have it, it's in the packet on the downloads that you got for the conference. But basically, there's two major differences between what the industry does in the marketplace and what the Bureau of Indian Affairs wants to see in a phase one. Their complete goal is to really eliminate any environmental liability. So if an environmental professional is looking at your property, you want to bring it into trust, and they're finding some things that are environmental concerns, the BIA may kick that back out and make the tribe do additional work, like a phase two, to clean up and then resubmit. If there's a way that you can evaluate that property even before you put it into an application, that would be a better way to go. And we're going to talk about how you can do that to set yourself up for that. But the policy you can see here on the Department of Interior is basically that the Bureau shall ascertain the nature and extent of potential liability from hazardous substances and environmental problems. Then it has to weigh the benefits of acquiring it relative to the total cost. And then it has to inform, for any congressionally mandated acquisition of contaminated property, they have to inform Congress about how much that's going to cost. So they're really intent on limiting their liability. The other thing that is important to know, of course, is the timing. I was looking at a couple of things online as I was preparing for this presentation, and where I come in is really in this process in step 7. This is for both on and off reservation property. And you can see there's steps that BIA goes through. When you get to step 7 on the environmental compliance review, there's a lot of other things that are related to NEPA or wetlands and others, but of course the phase 1 ESA is part of that too. So if that's step 7 and step 16 is your completed application packet, how long does it take to get from step 7 to step 16? Is that 2 weeks? Is that a few months? how long does it take? I mean, how long have you guys had a fee to trust application move through BIA? Yeah?
I'm BIA.
Oh, okay. Oh, good.
So in a perfect world, because it's a hurry up and wait type process.
Yes.
We're waiting for things to come back. Many things can run concurrently. So in a perfect world, I've accepted within 9 months.
So I have a question then. If you, and I work with the BIA in the Pacific Northwest, and on occasion, sometimes when they're going through the fee to trust application, they wait to request the Phase 1 ESA so that it still stays within that sort of shelf life. Have you heard of that? Do you do that as well?
Yeah.
Okay, that's good.
With the title commitment.
Mm-hmm.
We kind of make sure that we're not requesting those things again and again or getting it updated to save the applicant funds,
Yes.
So we're trying to time it just right to where we have everything at the time of acceptance, which is step 15.
Yes,
So,
okay.
So everything is current at that point.
Okay, good. Thank you. So essentially what I have here is the ASTM standards that the BIA follows and other Department of Interior bureaus follow is the same standard that, again, the marketplace follows in buying and selling property. It's intended to reduce liability, whereas and again, BIA could comment on this too, but the intent there is to limit as much as possible or eliminate that environmental liability because they have to speak to Congress and the federal government. So that's an issue of liability, and then there's the issue of timing, and we talked a little bit about that. The standard, again, is 12 months for a Phase 1 ESA. That's the shelf life, provided that after 6 months you evaluate your environmental records, your site reconnaissance, and your interviews again. And because the BIA has a fee to trust process that is somewhat phased, it's always good to remember that timing issue about when you're doing your environmental due diligence package for the BIA, what the timing looks like on that. So managing environmental due diligence, you want to make it easy for the BIA to say yes on that piece. So this is one small, this is one piece of a much larger fee to trust application. So if you can get that one piece on reducing their environmental liability or eliminating it, wouldn't you want to do that, right? To make it easy for them to say yes. You also want to time it so you address the issue of shelf life because again, it's only valid for a year provided that the interviews and the site recon and environmental records are conducted after 6 months. So that is in a nutshell why it's a good idea to start thinking about that environmental due diligence piece in your fee to trust applications. Going back a little bit, I'm going to step back now and talk a little bit about what environmental due diligence really is. And I call this CREX and HREX and REX oh my, because the ASTM standard identifies 3 definitions for what you see here, and we'll talk about that. So what is environmental due diligence? It's an evaluation of the environmental condition of a property generally completed prior to purchase or sale. In the case of a fee to trust, you may already have owned property in fee simple. You want to bring it into trust. That is also what basically the BIA is applying to this definition as well. Before they bring it in, they're going to want to understand the environmental condition of that property. Why is it important? Well, the biggest reason that it's important in the whole fallout from years ago in 1980 under the Comprehensive Environmental Reclamation Compensation Liability Act in 1980, CERCLA, was that it establishes defenses against that federal liability for contamination and cleanup, which can get really expensive. So CERCLA over the years has defined 3 defenses against federal liability for cleanup. This is where it gets a little dry, I'm sorry, but we'll get through this and then we'll have some fun. The innocent landowner defense, that basically means you had no reason to know, you didn't know, and you had no reason to know that you had environmental contamination on your property. Okay? There is a bona fide prospective purchaser's defense, and that means, well, we knew that there was contamination on the property, but we have done things to limit our environmental risk to human health or the environment. And there's the contiguous property owner defense. Let's just say you're a tribe and you're looking at buying a piece of property that might be near a service station. This is very simplistic, but the service station has had leaking underground storage tanks. The groundwater's contaminated. The groundwater's moving towards your property. That probably means, as a contiguous property owner, your groundwater's contaminated. So those kinds of defenses, if you can show one of those, that will help you avoid potential federal CERCLA liability. The other reason why you want to do environmental due diligence is because hidden environmental liabilities can be expensive, millions of dollars, and I think the cheapest I've seen on an environmental due diligence mistake was probably about $50,000. And of course, they can hold up a transaction. So what can you do as tribes to make it easier to get through that piece of the feat of trust application process? And this is where I think the history, it's really interesting to understand the history of environmental due diligence law in the United States. How many people are familiar with Love Canal? Yeah. So Love Canal was one of several major environmental catastrophes that occurred in the late 70s that promulgated the 1980s CERCLA law. But even more than that, there were some other really crazy things that happened in the late 70s through the early 80s, and one of them was Times Beach, Missouri. Has anyone ever heard of this crazy event that occurred here? Love Canal was really what was the impetus for the 1980 CERCLA law, but it was Times Beach, Missouri that really started the 1986 SARA amendments, which was the Superfund Reauthorization Act, or Superfund Amendments and Reauthorization Act. The CERCLA law was established in 1980. One of the reasons was because of Love Canal. And basically what the CERCLA law said is owners are liable for contamination on the property. And if you can't find a viable owner with the funds to pay for it, then they established the Superfund. And that money went to pay for cleanup, like situations like Love Canal. Love Canal was a low-lying area in New York, and it was completely surrounded by a neighborhood. And it was open dumping for many years, and the neighborhood encroached slowly on this area. It was a wetland area, so groundwater was really close to the ground. But over time, the drums started leaking, and it's still fenced off now. There's land use controls on it. You could actually still go there and take a look at it. Times Beach, Missouri was a little different. Times Beach was a company town. It was a company town, and it was owned by a newspaper company, probably called the Times. I don't know. But this town was a low income, working class town. They didn't have paved roads. They were dirt roads. Up the road a few miles was a beauty products manufacturer, and they would bring in all kinds of chemicals, and they would extract the chemicals that they wanted to put in things like toothpaste. And some of the chemicals were pretty nasty stuff. And they would get concentrated and put into underground storage tanks. One of the contaminants was dioxin. And very low concentrations of dioxin in these chemicals. But when they put it into the ground after they did this extraction process, it was pretty contaminated. They hired a chemical company to come and take care of the waste for them. Well, this chemical company was very good at selling chemicals, but they weren't so good at disposing of hazardous waste. So they hired a fellow, I cannot remember his name, but it's out there on the internet. He had a company who mixed waste oil, and he would spread it on streets to control dust. So this manufacturing company paid this chemical company about $6,000 a load, and this chemical company turned around and paid this local guy $1,500 a load to come and pick up the waste. And he would mix it with oil. Did a great job, really sticky stuff, laid it for years all over the streets. Couple of horse arenas got wind of this miracle oil placement on dirt and wanted this fellow to come out and put this oil in their horse arenas. This is probably about 78, 79, maybe into the 80s. And it worked great. Only within hours after placing this material, birds were falling down on the ground from the rafters, and they were dying, they were dead. Over the course of 3 to 4 weeks, the horses became more and more emaciated, sores, many of them died. The kids that were running in the horse arena, that were doing their lessons, had acne, which you get when you're exposed to dioxins. You've seen chloracne, it's what happens. The Center for Disease Control figured something was going on. By that time, a lot of the other horse arenas that had wanted this material, they started digging up the sawdust and bare dirt that was in the horse arena to dispose of it out back in the farm. But the worsening conditions really continued. And it wasn't until, I think, 1982 that the EPA finally came out and did some sampling a day before the entire town flooded out, completely wiped out the town. That is the impetus for the 1986 SARA amendments, something that most people don't know about. But it's really important to know why. Why do we have environmental due diligence? What's the history there? But at the time, which was interesting, in 1986, with the SARA amendments, it added this innocent purchaser's defense. Remember, in 1980, there was no defense. It was like, you're the property owner, you contaminated this, you're liable, and if you don't have the money, we've got a super fund that will help clean it up. Love Canal. 1986 comes around, and they add this innocent landowner defense, and they say if you conduct an appropriate level of inquiry into your property and the environmental condition, then we won't hold you liable. Well, guess what? The federal government didn't define all appropriate inquiry at that time. EPA didn't define that. It wasn't until 2002, or actually 2005, but during 2002, they added 2 more innocent or purchaser defense. They added the bona fide prospective purchaser defense and the contiguous property owner defense that we talked about earlier. And then it wasn't until 2005 that the EPA, that Congress mandated the EPA come up with what's called the All Appropriate Inquiry Rule. And that is a rule that is intended to satisfy that level of environmental inquiry into a property. So what was going on during this time in the marketplace, buying and selling property among banks, lawyers, and property owners? Well, when because there was a lack of definition about what all appropriate inquiry really was all about in 1986 with SARA amendments, the industry decided to get together and come up with their own standard protocol of what, if we could do something to evaluate the environmental nature of the property, what would we do? So the American Society for Testing Materials, ASTM, pulled together bankers, lawyers, property owners, real estate brokers, a consortium of people, and they decided that if we were to do these different things, if we were to look at the property, take photographs of it, if we were to do the research into what was on the property beforehand, if we were to talk to people that knew about the property, and walk the property, what could we put together in a report that would show that there has been some level of environmental due diligence done? And they came up with this standard. The standard went through several iterations beginning in 1993, and by 2005, ASTM got together with EPA because, again, the Congress wanted EPA to come up with an all-appropriate inquiry rule and said, hey, if you come up with this rule and you reference our standard, the 1527 standard, people that are using this standard will be able to satisfy all appropriate inquiry. Are you good with that? And they're like, yes, we're good with that. So that is how the parallel path on the industry came out, or patterned itself along the same lines as what was happening at the federal government level. The important thing that ASTM did was establish 3 definitions for environmental conditions that exist on your property. There was recognized environmental conditions, historical recognized environmental conditions, and controlled recognized environmental conditions. And real briefly, a recognized environmental condition is the presence or likely presence of any hazardous substance or petroleum products in, on, at a property due to a release to the environment, under conditions that are indicative of a release to the environment, or under conditions that pose a material threat of a future release to the environment. So things like staining on the ground, that's considered de minimis. That's really not considered a recognized environmental condition. If it was a huge, a bunch of drums that are stored and they're leaking everywhere, that would be considered a recognized environmental condition. Historical recognized environmental conditions are interesting because they would indicate a past release of a hazardous substance, but at the time that the release occurred, it was addressed to the satisfaction of the regulating agency, whomever that would be. So if you've got contamination, you found contamination in the ground and it was 100 parts per million petroleum, and the standard for cleanup was 300 parts petroleum per million. Let's just say this is in 1995. You meet the standard, so it's historical rec. But let's just say in 2015, you look at that data again, still have 100 parts per million petroleum in the ground, but this time, over the course of, 20 years, the standards have changed so that it's 50 parts per million. You no longer have a historical rec. You have a recognized environmental condition because the concentrations that may have met regulatory requirements way back when don't meet them now. Does that make sense? And then, of course, the other one is controlled recognized environmental conditions. Have you guys ever been out to a property where maybe they talk about there's a cap on the property, a soil cap, maybe you're playing baseball, or maybe you've been to a site in a property and they say it's capped with a liner and you can't dig in the soil, or maybe you've been to a property and there's a service station but it's all fenced off, right? There's a recognized environmental condition where a release has occurred, but it's controlled. So it's controlled by a fence, or it's controlled by a cap, like you're putting plastic down and then putting soil on it. You're basically capping contaminated soil that's in the ground. You don't have to move it. It's a recognized environmental condition, but it's being controlled. Okay? So you can do that with engineering, which is basically a cap or fence, or you can do it with institutional controls like an activity or use limitation. In other words, you've got contamination in the groundwater. The control there is don't drink it. It's fine where it is, but it's an institutional control. It's a controlled, recognized environmental condition. You can't drink the groundwater, and that happens a lot. So those are the different kinds of recognized environmental conditions. Okay, so y'all ready for a quiz to see how much y'all have learned? No? Maybe? Kind of, sort of? I don't know. Oh, let's just do it. It's really fun. Okay, the first one. Pipes on buildings. So I'm assuming that on various properties at the tri-bones, there's older buildings, there's newer buildings, different ages, right? Some of them are heated with oil, some of them may be heated electrically, who knows? What you see here, and what the arrow's pointing to, is a vent pipe. That's what that is. So if you follow up along the building and you look and you see at the very tip of it, there's holes at the top. That's a vent pipe for a tank. Tank usually will hold for heating would be petroleum, and that is venting the volatiles that are coming off the petroleum. Now, whether that tank is in the sidewalk or underneath the building or in the basement, who knows? But if you're looking at a property and you want to say, okay, I've got this property, the tribe wants to move it into trust, how about I go out there and take a look around and see if I can come up with any environmental conditions before we pay someone to come out and find them for us? You have a building, you're looking at that going, I don't know, maybe there's something there. How about this? What does that look like? What's that? It does look like a sewer pipe, but notice something. See this here? See how it's kind of dark and it comes all the way down here? It's leaking. It's leaking. This is more than likely a fill pipe for a tank, an underground storage tank, or it could be in the basement of that building, we don't know, but you can see staining around there, and that's actually what they look like. So a truck probably comes and attaches from the outside and fills up the tank. Is it a recognized environmental condition? Probably yes. Okay, how about this? How many tribes that are represented here have nurseries or plant nurseries in the property? Maybe? Okay. yeah. This is a former azalea nursery. And when you look at it, it looks, oh, yeah, it's, lots of pea gravel on the ground. That they actually kept things pretty nice. But what do you have associated with nurseries? Fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides. In the case of orchards, if there's orchards on tribal lands, apples or oranges or hazelnuts, lead arsenate sprays to control bugs. Historically, they don't go away. They build up in the soil. So you could have a complete orchard on your tribal land, or you want to acquire something that's adjacent, you might want to look for metals in soil. This property actually did have fairly high concentrations of herbicides, chlorinated herbicides in the ground on this site. What about these? Stored materials. They are soaked in oil. They're actually creosote-covered rail ties. So what this company did, they're sitting on an old railroad bed, and they just stack them up and they put them on top of the rail bed. Rail beds are interesting. If you're looking at acquiring property, maybe it's adjacent to maybe tribal land, or you're buying property in fee that has a rail line on it, you want to be aware of potential spills along the rail line. A lot of railroads would use pesticide, herbicide sprays to keep the weeds down. And of course, you could get leaching of creosote chemicals coming out of the wood and into the ground. And then, of course, there's uncontrolled dumping. Now, regular garbage in and of itself is not necessarily a wreck, but I've come across plenty of sites, especially in remote locations on some tribal lands I've been on, where maybe a contractor's doing some forest clearing, and they bring on oil tanks to refuel, and they just leave them there. They don't take them when they're done. So you might end up with a couple of drums of oil or fuel that are sitting out there. They don't necessarily look like this, but this is something that if you've got, long winding roads or unimproved roads that people have access to, this is often what you can find at the end of them. Okay, so now that all know what recognized environmental conditions are, let me get my paper. Where'd it go? I got my definitions here because even though I've been practicing this for almost 20 years, I always have to keep my full definition of what is a recognized environmental condition. Okay, so let's test your newfound knowledge. Is it a REC? Is it a recognized environmental condition? Okay, we're looking at a former service station. Is it a REC? Is it a recognized environmental condition? How many people think yes? I do. And yes, it is. Because, why? Under conditions that pose a material threat of a future release to the environment. You don't know that service station has had a release, right? And the point is, regardless of whether or not you identify recognized environmental conditions on your property, you're like, yeah, it might be, it may not be. The point is that it's a big enough concern to do something about it. So it doesn't have to meet an official definition of a recognized environmental condition, although when you hire an environmental professional, they're going to want to come out and identify these things, right, as RECs, as historic RECs, as controlled RECs, because that's what's required by the ASTM standard. But for you guys, when you're trying to figure out, when you're looking at a piece of property, what can you do before you hire a professional, these are the things that you can think about, okay? Leaking drums, is it a REC? It's a REC. That's pretty obvious. What about dry cleaners, dry cleaning facilities? Is it a REC? Could be. What's used at dry cleaning facilities? Yeah, perchloroethylene. Remember that smell? I used to love that smell too. Oh, when you'd get your clothes back in the 80s and early 90s, it had that really great, weird chemical smell. It was perchloroethylene. Yeah, I knew I was touched in the head, but. And then, of course, chemical handling. Chemical handling, is that a REC? It is, because it could be, let's see, the presence or likely presence of hazardous substances on, in, or at a property under conditions indicative of a release or under conditions that pose a material threat of a future release. So it's pretty sloppy. You could have drippings if you had concrete. I would call that a REC. Not all wrecks need to be dealt with because it's an ongoing operation, but you can limit the risk associated with them, right? Questions so far? No? Okay, here's another grouping. Is this a wreck? How about trash? No, not really. Unless you go and you find some chemical that's embedded there that's spread everywhere. You know, even a motor oil, it's de minimis. So generally trash isn't considered a wreck. How about dry material storage silos? Wreck? No, recognize? No, not unless they were storing you know, heavy metals in there, or some pellets or something that would get all over the ground, and then you have some metals contamination potentially. But no, not generally, no. How about non-compliant oil storage? So, yeah, it is. It is because it's under conditions that pose a material threat of a future release. Why? Because I don't see any protection around those drums. They're stacked up. Anybody could run into them. And what is that thing in front? The bollard? That's one simple bollard there to protect all of them? I don't think so. And then what about debris piles? What do you think? Exactly. It depends on if there's, you know, something dumped in there. You see these totes? You know, usually those totes will have chemicals in them. Some of them, depending on how toxic they are, some of them aren't that toxic, but some of them are. So it depends on what you find. Okay, here's a couple of tricky questions. That'll give you a hint. Medical waste. Is that a wreck? It's really not a wreck. It's not. Because the ASTM standard identifies certain things that are considered out of scope. Wetlands, mold, asbestos, regulated building materials, those are extra. They're not considered part of the ASTM standard. So my question for my BIA friends over here is, these out-of-scope items, are they still a concern for BIA? And how would a tribe address these non-ASTM scope items? I know I'm putting you on the I'm putting you on the spot, but how would a tribe address those in a fee to trust application if there's an old house on the property that is so old that it might contain asbestos? Would the BIA require an asbestos survey as part of it?
I'm not sure. I turn to our environmental people for this.
Yep.
So I'm not sure. I know for like I've seen issues where there was an old house with the paint field, lead paint, and asbestos, and maybe mold. And I guess it all looks back. We look to the purpose and need of that acquisition. So it all ties into that. But for environmental fixes, I would have to have my environmental
Sure.
engineer help. You know.
Yeah, no, I didn't mean to put you on. So I can tell you what my experience has been. Normally, if it's an issue, if the tribe is going to take down the building, there's already federal standards for asbestos anyway, that you have to do an asbestos survey. You have to do a lead-based paint survey. So we would go ahead and do those out-of-scope items added on to the Phase 1 ESA. But I just wanted you guys to be aware that even though these are environmental issues, they're traditionally not part of a Phase 1 ESA, although the BIA could require it. Yes?
What's your experience on wetlands?
Yeah, so wetlands are definitely not part of an ASTM scope, but a lot of us that work in the sort of the environmental due diligence world also have experience in natural resources like wetlands. So the way we deal with that is if we're out, we're cross-trained. A lot of environmental professionals are. So if you're out on a property and you're looking at for recognized environmental conditions and you see something that is something that the tribe should be aware of so they can make note of it, that it's not part of the scope, then you let them know and you identify that not necessarily in the report, but in a letter, an additional letter that would go with it. That's typically how we handle wetlands.
When wetlands, let's say, is 25% of a 100-acre piece of property,
Yep.
That's not going to stop the future truck process.
No, it shouldn't. That's right. So, again, the Phase 1 ESA is only part of that Step 7. The Step 7 is environmental compliance review, so it has a lot of things going on, almost like a natural resources review and all kinds of other things. And part of that would be the wetlands. Typically, what the environmental professional should do when the tribe hires them, get enough information from the tribe about what is on the property so that they can say, okay, we're going to do this Phase 1 ESA. Have you also considered a wetland delineation? Have you also considered a regulated building materials survey? That kind of thing. Oh, good. This is my favorite part. Now there's tools that you guys can use. So I put this together with the idea that if you're a land staff member and you are looking at property, there are things that you can do yourselves based on limitations of budget and time to help you get a good idea of what your property might look like to an environmental professional in a final report to the BIA as part of a fee to trust application. So the first idea that I wanted to convey is you're really looking at reducing your liability, your environmental liability before the fee to trust process. Okay, you're reducing the BIA's liability before the fee to trust process. And you do that by three things. You're going to research this property, you're going to discover anything on the property, and then you're going to address anything that you find. Okay? So the first thing on research, and I don't know if I can get this, but I'm hoping that I can. There are lots and lots of internet resources out there depending on what state you're in. There are great things that you can do just at your fingertips. And one of them is, let's see if I can get to it. Nope, can't. Okay, that's a bummer. This presentation will be, don't do that to me. Well, let's see what's going to happen. What that link will take you to is an EPA EnviroFax site. And on that site, you can go on and you can click in different cells and type in your, even your, where you're located, what the property, so if it's off reservation, if it's somewhere else it's off reservation, you can type in the address. If it's on reservation, what's really cool is at the very bottom of, when you click on that link at the very bottom, they have tribal lands. You can click on tribal lands and you can actually go to your tribe, wherever that is in the state, and click on that. And what will come up is a list of all properties within 1 mile, or maybe you want 3 miles, you choose, that have some kind of contamination or some environmental challenge. It could be wetlands, it could be air quality issues, it could be groundwater contamination, and it could be on your tribal lands. But it's a great resource. It's something that is a go-to that you can do yourself and go and check to see what's on your land. The second is a lot of these states now have really great GIS databases that many of you are hopefully familiar with if you're using ArcGIS and developing a GIS program with your tribe. I highly recommend it because it's a wonderful way for you to manage the properties that you have, especially for environmental conditions. That's why I have on the end here, look at your tribal GIS data, look at your county and state GIS and federal. And if you don't have Google Earth Pro, download Google Earth Pro, because Google Earth Pro, you can zoom into the property of your interest and you can actually go back in time for as far back as, sometimes I've been able to get it back as far as 30 years. And you can see property changes over time, which is what you're looking at here on these two aerial photographs. These are all free resources. This is what I mean by doing research. Research it first on the property that you have. I've been on properties where, and it pays to be a geologist. I don't normally wear these clothes. I'm usually in my jeans and boots, but I go out to a property, if you know your property, and I'm looking at it, and it was an old quarry, and I start to dig down, and I see this gray stuff. What is this? And I'm looking at it, oh, I know what this is. This is ash from Mount Mazama. So I can go back and do the research and see exactly where the winds took the Mazama ash and where it headed up. I'm in the Pacific Northwest on the Western Mountains, and I can see the depths. And I'm like, okay, that's what this is. It's not some weird thing that someone left because they were digging out this quarry that was on tribal lands, or at least a land that they were going to move into trust. So that's one circle of the 3 circles approach. The second is you're going to discover. So you're going to go out to the property with the eyes that you've gained looking at these photographs. The idea is to just stay curious. Let one thing lead to another and ask why. Why does it look like that? Why? Always ask why. In these two photographs, what you have is a septic, right? And a septic tank by itself would likely not be a problem. But what if the septic tank was located in a property that the tribe might be looking at that was used as a auto service shop? What could potentially happen there? I'll tell you what can potentially happen there, and it has happened there, and we have found things there. The dumping down the toilet. Oils, right? Degreasers, just flush them down the toilet. They go into the septic tank and out into the leach field, and there's your contamination. So things like that to be aware of. The second photograph was just drums that were left out at a property. Where did they come from? What do they contain? You're taking your photographs and then you're completing a property checklist. This checklist is called a transaction screen questionnaire, but it doesn't matter. It's probably about 10 pages long. This checklist is included in your documentation that you'll have to take home with you. You can print this out. You can create your own checklist, but what it does is when you're out to a property and you're looking at it, it'll walk you through yes or no questions, what you see, what it's looking like, who did you talk to, that kind of thing. That's the second circle for discovering. And then once you find something, if you find something, then you're going to manage the environmental conditions that you find. In the case here, this was one of the tribal properties they were looking at. The one on the far left was just a barn, but there was a significant amount of heavy staining all over the place. And it wasn't de minimis because it didn't go just 6 inches into the soil. It went down about 2 feet. So we dug it out. We did this, the tribe had a phase 1 done before it went to feed a trust. They addressed the recognized environmental condition. They didn't have to hire us. I mean, they had the expertise to do it in-house. But I just wanted to use it as an example. They cleaned this up. Then they had the environmental professional come in and do the phase 1 ESA and put that into their application because that was addressed and it was buttoned up. Same thing here. If you find a tank, remove the tank. Remove the tank and do some soil sampling. Okay, you can hire someone to pull the tank, take soil samples, get that buttoned up, do a good enough job where you can show the regulators or the BA that, yeah, we moved this tank, we did sampling, the groundwater was very deep or it was very shallow and we sampled it and there was nothing. You can manage those recs before you go into a feed a trust application situation. The final bit that I wanted to talk about, this is sort of the aperitif at the end of the dinner, is just about identifying your brownfield opportunities and cataloging those as opportunity sites. Beyond feed a trust, there are a lot of properties within tribal lands that might have issues with being underutilized. I'm getting ahead of myself. Brownfield property is basically the expansion, redevelopment, or reuse of a property of which may be complicated by the presence or potential presence of contamination. If you look at it as an opportunity, it's a great idea because there's a lot of government money out there, especially for tribes. They're looking for tribes to come up with grant applications to do assessments on tribal lands that they already own. And tribal lands that maybe or lands that they're considering bringing into trust. These issues, while they could be potential wrecks, as we already discussed, they're also brownfields. That's a closed service station. This is a closed dry cleaner. If that's anywhere on property that you're considering acquiring or is already within your tribal lands, consider it a brownfield. Consider it an opportunity. To request or to put together a grant application. Other potential brownfields are known contaminated properties. If you do have known contamination on one or more of your properties on tribal lands, that is a perfect example of getting a grant for cleanup. Or even perceived contamination. as these two photographs show, or even underutilized property. How many abandoned buildings do you have in your tribal lands? How many stores that are closed? Those could be opportunities. And if you treat them as brownfield opportunities, you can tell a really great story to the EPA and get funding to address those potential brownfields, they are brownfields, and put them back into productive use, do something with them. This is actually where using GIS data comes in handy, and that is if you were to decide that you wanted to do a community-wide evaluation of your brownfields, that is underutilized property, perceived contamination, on or off reservation, you can get a community-wide assessment grant from the EPA. And you conduct outreach to your community and find out what's important to them. What is most important to them? Is it natural resources? Is it the history? Is it the culture? Is it where site's located? Is it economic development? All of those things are important, but you'd come up with a ranking score, okay? And you would rank all the properties that you find that have potential brownfield opportunities, and you would put them into a list like this. And on the far left, you'll see that they're all these properties are numbered, and they're translated through just a simple GIS platform. All of them are located here. On the top, you have information about that property, and what you don't see are the ranking criteria that was used on this one. But basically, every number or every criteria has a rank and a percent weight. Let's just say economic development is the number one, and that gets a higher weight on a property. And you go through and you evaluate those things, and what you end up is having a roadmap for requesting funds for cleanup, requesting grant money for putting property back into economic use. Here's a really good example of one that we did. I believe, I'm thinking this was in Oregon City, Oregon. That little yellow area represents a downtown, no, that's not the downtown core. I'm not sure exactly what that one represents, but you can see the property there. You've got it outlined, the red, in the area in red was part of the community-wide assessment. The area in green, obviously, is your natural resources areas. And then they rank the sites based on the location, the community importance, natural resources, the degree of contamination or perceived contamination, and then the overall economic development potential. And then when they did that, then they were able to approach, you can actually get two kinds of grants. You can actually get a grant to do this, okay? You can actually tell a story and get a community-wide assessment grant to do this very thing, or once you've done it, you can get a grant to clean it up, okay? This link here, I won't try it, but it's a great link. It's by the Kansas State University, and it will walk you through the step-by-step process of applying for these types of grants. There was a tribe, I can't remember which tribe, applied for a grant in 2017, but all of their data and all the information that they used is on there for you to take a look at and evaluate if that's something that you could use for your tribal lands. I think, oh, now we're going to recap. Okay. Yes, let's do recap. So the bottom line is we want to get to yes. On that small part of the FEDA Trust application, we want the BIA to say yes to the environmental due diligence piece. And we can do that by reducing or eliminating the recognized environmental conditions on a property. And we want to time the Phase 1 ESA from your environmental professional so that you're not having to go and do another one because the shelf life is beyond 6 months, okay? Again, something to do in-house before you even get to the application is conduct some research on the property, discover what's out there, using your checklist, looking at your photographs or taking photographs, and then if you need to, address them in some way to address those conditions. And my company, I love this map, but I overlaid all the offices where we work, and I actually did a kind of talked to a few people in our Phoenix office that work with several tribal nations in that area, but It's an honor to work with the tribes as they move through fee to trust and even fee simple projects. If there's any questions, I'd be happy to take them now, or if you have questions about any of the material or any additional questions, or comments would be great too. I know it's a lot of information, it's a lot of data, but this presentation is on your documents that you have, and you can go and take a look at it, that the conference put together, so. Yes?
The phase one ESA comes pretty far into the land and trust process. Do you have a recommendation? So our land and trust process usually doesn't start for a few years after the purchase of the land. Do you have a recommendation for some sort of evaluation to just purchase a fee that may or may not be taken?
Sure. So his question was, is there another kind of environmental due diligence that you can use that may not be as top-heavy or as in-depth as a full Phase 1 ESA? And yes, there is. There's a product called the Environmental Transaction Screen, which is what that checklist was, and that is actually in your conference materials. So that's what I would use, and it will walk you through the process. So if you're looking at property and you don't really have the time or budget to go and do a full Phase 1, that's a perfectly fine way to look at property. It's a good question. Good. Anybody else? Anybody have any interesting environmental problems on their properties that you've run into? Strange things? No. Crickets.
I think there's some people saying that there's family buried there, that it was like a family cemetery.
Oh,
And
yes.
a lot of times they can't find
Yeah.
no.
Yes. So a weird environmental condition associated with cemeteries is barium. And I've come across an old cemetery where it was a military cemetery and high concentrations of barium. They have to be pretty high. Barium is, ubiquitous in the environment, but there were really high concentrations of barium because I don't know if they were flooding the bodies with it for preserving or what, but it's very strange. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, the only thing that you could potentially do is there's all kinds of tools that you can hire contractors to do for you, and one of them is, it wouldn't be a magnetometer survey, but it would be a geophysical survey, and they walk around with this unit, and they're shooting down sound waves, and they're bouncing back off, I'm sorry, not sound waves, electrical waves to get down through the soil. And what they can do by the different densities in the soil, they can evaluate whether there's a former cavity there by moving through the different densities of material. And so if you really want to know if you've got people buried somewhere, then you could do what they did when they were looking for Jimmy Hoffa and bring out the geophysical survey. And that's actually what they did in one situation. They brought out a geophysical survey equipment and they scanned the area and they were able to find anomalies. And then when you find those anomalies, then you can dig or excavate those and see what you find. Yeah, yep. Anybody else? No? Well, thank you all for coming, much appreciated. And there was a lot of detail. I'll be here afterwards if you want to come up and talk and have any additional questions. So thank you.